Hello everyone. So today we are going to do some practicing in vocal delivery. So how do we speak for optimal understanding for our audiences? Now, a brief overview of some of the aspects we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a few elements of clear speaking. We're going to talk about vocal variety, certain pronunciations of words and how that might factor into giving a good speech. We're going to talk about potential distracting vocal characteristics and then next steps to work toward improving your speaking skills. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about elements to clear speaking. So the first is volume. Now, a lot of times when we are giving a speech, it can be very challenging to use volume because it feels like we are yelling. But even though it feels like yelling from our perspective, it's what's needed to engage with the audience and to make sure that we are heard. The key factor with this is more air and breath support. Without this, you might sound like you're yelling, or you're going to feel like you're constantly out of breath, and it's not going to be healthy for your voice to try and speak loudly in that way. Another key aspect of volume is that with your volume, you are maintaining the rhythms of normal conversations. Let me just move this out of the way. This is another area where sometimes we see people going wrong, is they are speaking in ways that don't sound natural to how they would normally speak. They have pauses at weird times. A lot of times this is because of a lack of air and breath support that makes the rhythm get out of time. Another thing that's important to think of when trying to muster up volume is to practice speaking and projecting to the back of the room. Instead of picturing yourself talking to the people right in front of you, picture yourself speaking all the way to the people that are all the way in the back of the room. That is going to be the best way for you to project. Now, when we think about the speed at which you're talking, this is roughly around 150 words per minute. Now, a way that you can calculate how fast you're speaking is by finding something that's fairly easy to read and reading it for 3 to 4 minutes or so, just at a steady, natural pace. And then if you're using an online resource, you can see how many words are in what you read, and then divide that by the number of minutes you read to see how many words you read per minute. A key aspect with speed, a lot of times when we are speaking, we have the tendency to speed up. So it's important to plan to speak slower than you would in normal conversations. For example, sometimes I talk kind of fast and then it's hard to understand what I'm saying. But if I slow down, I can make sure that I am clearly understood by my audience. So it might feel a little slower than normal, a little less natural, but it's going to be the best way to make sure that your audience knows what you're saying and can follow what you're saying. If you go too slow, though, your audience is going to become bored and they're going to disengage. But if you go too fast, they're going to have trouble following all of the information that you're giving them. The final aspect for elements to clear speaking is clarity. A phrasing that we use in music settings a lot is this idea of lips, teeth, tip of the tongue. So it's very forward. All of these elements that are going to give you clear diction and articulation that are going to make sure you're understood. When we do this, though, we want to be careful that we're not over-enunciating. So when we are pronouncing words, we don't want to overemphasize sounds that we wouldn't normally make anyway. We want to be careful with over-enunciating because this can become distracting. If we are over-articulating every single word that we're saying, then people aren't going to be interested, and that's going to become very distracting. So we still want to use natural ways of speaking, but we want to use those words clearly for our audience to understand. Next is vocal variety. So we just talked about having an appropriate volume, having a steady speed that's easy to understand, and also having clarity. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to speak the exact same way all the time. We want to vary our pitch so that we're engaging to listen to. As you may or may not have noticed throughout my time talking so far, my voice is going up and down. I'm not talking here the whole time, because if I were talking here the whole time, you're not going to want to listen to me, because I have no variation in my pitch, I have no variation in my rate, and I have no variation in my volume. So I want my voice to go up and down, to follow with what I'm saying, and to create a more engaging conversational aspect to my speech that's enjoyable to listen to. I also want to change the rate at which I'm speaking. There might be times where I want to go a little faster to emphasize potentially excitement or something that is feeling like there's a lot happening and I'm trying to emphasize that point, or I might want to slow down to really make my point clear. So for example, I might be talking about how life has just been getting so crazy and I'm doing all these things and it's hard to keep track of everything, but sometimes we just need to take a minute and slow down. So you see how I used the rate of speech to follow along with what I was saying and create more interest. I went from fast to slow. The same goes with volume. Sometimes we have a really emphatic point that we need to make loud and clear. And other times, what's engaging is when we come in close and draw listeners in to what we're saying. So again, we see a variation of pitch, we see a variation in the rate of speech, and we see a variation in the volume being used. All of these are important in helping to engage our listeners to be interested in what we're talking about. Now let's talk a little bit about pronunciations. Wherever you go, you are going to encounter people who pronounce words differently. If you look at different regions in the United States, even different cities in the same state, you're going to see people who say words a little bit differently. And that's perfectly okay. But there are times where there are words that can become distracting to listeners when they hear it pronounced a way that's not as common or is considered incorrect according to the more standard pronunciations. For example, think of the word nuclear versus nuclear. Technically, nuclear is an incorrect pronunciation. And some listeners hearing you say that, if they don't say nuclear as nuclear, might view you as uneducated or unintelligent because you're mispronouncing a word. Now, this might not be a fair assessment, but it is still something that we do. So it's important to use pronunciations that are more acceptable to your audience and are going to prevent the least amount of distraction. So some ways you can do this is, if you know that you have some of these words that are habitually mispronounced according to the standard pronunciations, as you're preparing for your speech, practice saying these in the more common and acceptable ways so that it is not as distracting for your listeners. Now, if you're encountering new or unfamiliar words, look up pronunciations. If there are multiple pronunciations, try and find what is the most common and preferred. A great thing that you can do is to reference the ways that news anchors pronounce words. They have a pretty standard pronunciation that is meant to follow that non-distracting type of speech. So news anchors could be a great source. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some distracting vocal characteristics. Now there's some aspect of not being able to change the way that we talk and the way that we speak, but there are some ways that we can help make our voice more enjoyable to listen to and more engaging for our audience. One is voice quality. There's a few different ways that your voice quality might become distracting. One is if you talk in a really harsh or hoarse voice, people might have this thought of, why aren't you clearing your throat? You sound like you need to cough. Another aspect is talking with a really breathy voice. This can make you sound really childish and potentially not very bright or weak, and people aren't gonna want to listen to what you say because you don't sound confident. So you want to make sure that you speak with a full voice. Part of this comes with that breath support to be able to engage your listeners. Another aspect, I can't mimic this as well, but is nasality. Now, some people have a very naturally nasally voice, but when you're speaking, we want to avoid sounding like we're congested or have that hypernasal tone. With all of these, we want our voice quality to be clear and to assert confidence and be understandable. The next one is a big challenge with speaking, which is vocalized pauses and sounds. Now, the most common, you think of ums and uhs. Every other word, I have to pause to think about what I'm saying. But it's not just these vocalized sounds, it's also words that we use habitually. You might also hear people using like or so in a lot of their sentences, like as I'm trying to figure out what I'm saying. So it's kind of like this or that, and there's this like unsurety in what I'm saying when I'm using these filler words. And they don't have much meaning in this context, so they become equivalent to filler sounds, such as and Others might be ending phrases continually with or whatever, or, also creating a sense of a lack of confidence in what you're saying, or creating the perception that you don't really care about what you're talking about. Now, there are many more examples of vocalized pauses and sounds and phrases that you might come across. These are just a few that are very common for us to stumble into. One of the challenging things with this is when we try to take out these pauses, we're not replacing them with anything except silence. And a second of silence when you're speaking feels like forever. But trust me, to the audience, it is not. It's important to allow yourself to collect your thoughts, to pause, and then transition to your next point. The words that you are saying are going to be a lot more impactful the fewer vocalized pauses and sounds you use throughout your speech. Now, we're also going to talk about articulation. In this case, we have substitutions of letters, like when someone has a lisp. They're going to say things like the solution instead of solution, replacing certain sounds with others. You also might hear people add sounds to words, such as saying athlete instead of athlete, realtor instead of realtor, or they might take out sounds, omissions, shortening words like doing instead of doing, or regular instead of regular. So with articulation, this connects to pronunciation. We want to make sure that what we are saying is clear and that we are correctly pronouncing words and articulating our words to be understood. Once again, while this may not be a fair assessment, poor articulation can lead to a decrease in your credibility for listeners. They might perceive you as more uneducated because of these irregular articulations that they view as inferior or incorrect. You also want to be careful with repeated inflection patterns. This goes back to variation when talking about your volume and your pitch and all of these things. Inflection patterns you also want to add variety to. You don't want to go down every sentence, because if you do, it gets repetitive. And the more that you do this, the more people disengage. It's the same thing over and over. There's no variation. This sing-songy pattern that feels the same every time can become lulling to your listeners. So you want to make sure you have times where you go up and times where you go down. We want to have variation in our inflection patterns. So what are our next steps? 1, practice. All of these skills, the only way that you can get better at them is to practice them. And 2, get feedback. Take videos of yourself, watch them back. Have other people watch you speak and give you feedback. especially if you can get a video of yourself and watch it with someone else so you can see what you're doing and they can also see what you're doing. There are so many things that we do that we get used to, that become normal, and we don't realize that for people who are not familiar with us or haven't interacted with the way that we speak in everyday settings, they might become distracted by the way that we're speaking in a speech because it's unfamiliar and can feel incorrect at times. So next to this, I have this quote, this short little paragraph. I had ChatGPT generate a little paragraph that would be a good way to practice speaking and practice some of these variations. So I'm going to read through this once, trying to not use any of the skills that I've talked about, and then I'm going to read through it a second time, trying to implement as many of them as I can. Now, as you practice, you might want to focus on one aspect in particular. You don't have to try and do it all at once. But in this case, just to show you a general before and after, I'll show you how this can affect the way that you speak. So here's if I'm using a monotonous voice, if I'm not varying my speech patterns, if I am including vocalizations throughout as well. Today, I want to talk about the power of resilience. Life often throws challenges our way, unexpected obstacles that test our strength and determination. But resilience isn't like just about surviving tough times. It's about embracing them, learning from them, and using those lessons to grow. Each of us has the capacity to rise above adversity, and when we do, we not only transform our own lives, but inspire others to do the same. So this was a bit of an over-exaggeration, but there were a lot of vocalizations, lots of ums and uhs. It was all the same tone. It was very boring to listen to. It felt like I was reading from a script. Now I'm going to try it, incorporating some different aspects we've talked about. I'm going to remove my filler words. I am going to try and vary my tone and vary my speed at which I'm talking and my pitch and all of those things. And let's see how this is a little bit different. Today, I want to talk about the power of resilience. Life often throws challenges our way, unexpected obstacles that test our strength and determination. But resilience isn't just about surviving tough times. It's about embracing them, learning from them, and using those lessons to grow. Each of us has the capacity to rise above adversity. And when we do, we not only transform our own lives, but inspire others to do the same. And now it's your turn. Whether you want to practice with this paragraph that I've provided for you, or you want to practice with your own speeches that you're working on, I would encourage you to look for one, maybe two of these areas that you might be particularly struggling with right now. And I want you to practice with some sort of speech to go through and try and implement one or two of the techniques that we talked about. The more you practice, the better you'll get to be more confident, more engaging, and more trustworthy as a speaker.